In this section, we are going to work on the archetypical self-states. They are called dot because they come from the origins of humanity. Every human being who has inhabited the planet has had to deal with these self-states because they are part of the human experience. So, up to this point, you already know that your self-state is surrounded by compulsive and repressive forces, and that core self-state is also surrounded by your internal self-states. That is, those characters that have arisen throughout your life and that you use at an unconscious level as a way to obtain quick answers to deal with the experiences that your environment subjects you to. Archetypical self-states arise below these internal self-states. They are hidden because they are part of your unconscious, the one we are bringing to light in this section. In another module or program, I plan to work on the whole topic of psychoanalysis in greater depth. Here, let's stick with the idea that you come with archetypical self-states which are infinite. You already know that your self-states are activated under certain conditions and make you act in certain ways. In the case of archetypical self-states, here I am going to focus on three that have a lot of influence on your psyche. On the one hand, you will find your father's self-state, on the other, your mother's self-state, and finally, for the purposes of this section, you will find your child's self-state. As you can see, they are archetypical because all human beings have within us a child or a father or a mother that is activated under certain conditions and that leads us to act in a certain way or make certain decisions without us being aware that that state of the self is manifesting. Now, what is the problem with not knowing and controlling these self-states? It is the same as what I indicated in the previous section. It is very possible that if you do not have these self-states under control, one of them will manifest very strongly and will subject your entire psychic system to its entire will. Therefore, it will not be you who is in control of your destiny, but it will be that state of self that finds its origin in the relationship you had with the people who generated that state of self, that is your father or your mother or the child who was atrophied inside your being due to the traumatic experiences you had at that stage of your life. Let's now look at some examples of how these self-states that I am talking about here manifest themselves. In the case of the father's self-state, you can observe it in people who assume the personality of a father under any circumstance. This father is usually someone who wants others to do his will, follow his advice, and make the best decisions for his survival. He is always looking for the convenience of others. Ultimately, let others live as he would like to do. There are brothers who get too involved in their brothers' lives. I am referring to decisions making when they are issues in which they do not have to get involved. If you look closely, they are people who cannot help but be controlling fathers to others. But that state of the father's self not only manifests in relation to others, but it could also manifest in relation to yourself. You could have an overdeveloped father self-state, and that will cause that every time you want to do something, you will avoid it because that inner father in you represents you, for example. Let's see what happens with the mother's self-state, which, like the father's self-state, find its origin in the relationship you had with your mother in your childhood. That mother, who perhaps treated you badly or who did not give you the affection and understanding that you needed at that stage of your life, remained in your psyche as a kind of a spiritual force which is activated under certain circumstances and that leads you to relate to the others the same way you did with your mother. A very obvious effect of this, which also applies to the father's self-state in the case of men, could be the way you relate to your potential romantic partners. If you had a very conflictive relationship with your mother during your childhood, you will find the answer to why you have developed such conflictive relationships with your romantic partners, whether in your childhood or youth. Now, people who have a highly developed mother self-state tend to worry too much about others, many times by those who don't care, another effect of the manifestation of this state. What happens to the child's self-state? As you can infer, it is also a remnant of that child you were in your childhood. That child who suffered certain traumatic experiences and that did not find affection, understanding, protection from the adults with whom you interacted or from the friends you had at that time, and that by not treating it continues to influence your adult life without you being aware that it is there, leading you to make decisions or act in certain way. I am sure that in your own reality, you have seen people who under certain circumstances cannot help but transform into children. They live joking or playing with other people in circumstances in which they should not do so. Like certain type of boyfriends who play practical jokes on their partners. Or in the workplace where there are usually bosses who can help but make fun of their employees. As you can infer, it is the state of the child self that takes control of that person without the person who is suffering the effects of it being able to do anything to avoid it. The problem is that this self state also affects the people with whom it interacts. There are parents, on the other hand, who cannot help but behave like children under certain circumstances. Maybe you had a parents like this, and now you can understand why your parents never protected you. Because they were children. One of the consequences of this state of the child self is that it usually generates people who are too vulnerable from an emotional point of view. They cannot help but feel belittled, undervalued, or like they need someone to protect them when they feel threatened or poorly treated. Another consequence is that they tend to be overly trusting of people they don't have to trust. These are some examples that I am giving you of archetypical states. Here, the only thing I am looking for is for you to become aware that they exist inside your psyche and that they generate effects on you. Given this frame of reference, the exercise we are now going to do is for you to learn to recognize your own archetypical self-states and what effects they have on you. To do this, I want you to take your psychic mapping notebook. You can take the complete one, but if you want to save time, you already know that you can download the corresponding sheet in this section. So in the first chart, you can see that you have the father's self-state, the mother's self-state, and the child's self-state. In the second box, I want you, after thinking, to write what kind of relationship you had with your father, what kind of relationship you had with your mother, and what kind of relationship you had with your childhood. That is how those people treated you. Was your father constantly criticizing you, or was always encouraging you to be a better person? Was your mother a person who encouraged you to take risks, or was she always warning you or challenging you for what you did or didn't do? You liked yourself as a child, or you hate that child you were at that time? These types of things are what I want you to define in this section. Once you have defined that, I want you to indicate in the next table what your father was like, what your mother was like, and what you were like as a child. That is, was your father a happy man or a bitter man? Was your mother a fun woman, or was she always sad? As a child, were you someone daring, or on the contrary, were you someone who was always doing the will of others? If you look with these two exercises, we have already found what has remained in your psyche as a remnant of your real father, mother, and child, which have now been transformed into self states that lead you to make decisions. For example, if your father was a very bitter man, you will notice that you also become very bitter under certain circumstances. That is the effect that the father self state has on you. If your mother was a very sad or insecure or hysterical woman, you will notice that you also take on those characteristics under certain circumstances. And that is why in the third box, I want you to think, define, and write precisely in the circumstances under which that state of the father, mother, and child self manifests in your life. For example, your father's self state might manifest when you meet your siblings. Your mother's self state could occur when you are at work in the relationship you have with your boss. And your child's self state could manifest when some people you value threaten to abandon you. To give some examples, the idea here is simply that you become aware of the existence of those archetypical self states and that you learn the circumstances under which that self state manifests in your life. In the next section, we are going to work on the topic of transforming your self state.